Hi, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, and welcome to the May book talk in the series that the Skyscraper Museum does usually once a month. And this is actually the second in the series of looking at Fifth Avenue, a kind of social slash architectural history of Fifth Avenue. And tonight we have a pre-pub preview of When Women Ran Fifth Avenue. Julie Satow, an award-winning author and a repeater at the Skyscraper Museum, because 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, she gave a talk on her book on the Plaza, the great Fifth Avenue facing hotel. And and you can go back and watch that if you become a Julie Satow junkie on our website, where all of our past programs are archived. In that book talk, she revealed and kind of explained her approach to a kind of social history, urban history, but history of buildings' lives. And added to that in this book, in this new book, is the history of women and their place in society, in business, in New York City. And what better place to look at the birth of that and also its blossoming than on Fifth Avenue. And I'm going to invite Julie to come on the screen in a moment, but I want to give a little bit of background. And I also want to remind you, actually, with this slide, of the previous look at the architectural history and the urban development, really, of Fifth Avenue as it marched up the island. That is on our website and was last month by professor at NYU, Mosette Broderick, who worked for many, many years on the subject of Fifth Avenue, New York's great avenue. So tonight, we go a little bit more into this social and cultural history, but through the lens of women and fashion. And also, as per Julie's subtitle, Glamour and Power. And I'm going to let Julie explain how she approached the topic, and of these three particularly adept and talented women who really kind of found their element in the world of consumer goods on Fifth Avenue, an identity that remains to this day. So Julie is as I said, a previous author and speaker in this series, and her award-winning book on the Plaza, but she has a long history in writing as a journalist. She has written for the New York Times about real estate. She has many other credits to and publications to her credit, a regular contributor to the New York Times. So among her talents, she is a very good writer. So she will remind you of the places, and you can see on our website where you can buy the book. And we hope that you'll explore online, receiving the book when it's published in just 2 weeks. So let me invite Julie onto the screen. And Julie, please take it away.
Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming on. I should say up front that the book is not out yet. It's not out for another 2 weeks, and you are my guinea pigs, since I have not given any talks yet about the book, and in fact, just finished putting together this slideshow about 10 minutes ago. So I'm really hoping that it makes sense and is great, but I would appreciate your understanding if I'm not completely quick and easy with everything that I'm doing. So as I said, this is my very first talk, so thank you so much. I'm gonna jump right in, since there's a lot to go through. I am not going to tell you everything that's in the book, because I'm really hoping you guys will have your appetite whetted and you'll want to pre-order it right away, which would be amazing, and then you'll get the whole full story. But I'm gonna highlight some things just so you can get familiar. Once Americans purchased what they could not make themselves in dry goods shops, which were typically cramped spaces filled floor to ceiling with a hodgepodge of goods, ranging from coffee tins to bags of flour. There was little thought about how these things were organized. They often remained on the shelves for months, even years, growing stale, gathering dust. And this all sort of changed in the early 20th century. In 1838, Le Bon Marché opened in Paris, and it's often credited as the world's first department store. Its enormous plate glass windows featuring mannequins dressed in the latest fashions were astonishing, as was the fact that any person could freely enter with no obligation to buy, just for the joy of running their hands over a display of silk shawls, or to try on parasols, or smell the aromas wafting from the perfume counters. In America, the Marble Palace stunned onlookers when it opened in 1846 on Chambers Street. It boasted novelties like a ladies' parlor where women could preen in front of Parisian imported full-length mirrors, which were very unusual back then. And in 1862, the store's founder, Alexander Turney Stewart, who would become actually the third richest man in America after William Astor and Cornelius Vanderbilt, opened an even larger and more opulent shopping mecca, the Cast Iron Palace. Among its fans was Mary Todd Lincoln, whose compulsive clothes buying habit was so severe that she ran up a tab that equated to about $500,000 in a single summer, and which her husband, President Abraham Lincoln, definitely could not afford to repay. Located on Broadway between 9th and 10th Street, the Cast Iron Palace became the cornerstone around which an entire shopping mecca sprouted. Ladies' Mile ran from Astor Place to Madison Square Park and earned its moniker from the crush of mostly white, middle and upper class women who appeared there daily, partaking in the new national pastime of window shopping. During this era, department stores were really sort of this land of glamour and possibility. In a single afternoon, you could have the details of your wedding or funeral planned. You could find out the dates for a civil service examination, send a telegram at a Western Union outpost, drop your baby at the nursery to have a leisurely lunch in the tea room, and then go to the hair salon to have your hair done, arrange for the express delivery of an ermine fur wrap to your home, buy refrigerated steaks, and order a pair of rare green parakeets from the Seychelles Islands. And I'm not exaggerating. But while the stores were palatial wonderlands, for women, they offered something even greater. From their very inception, these stores were really uniquely female universes where female customers held sway over male clerks whose job it was to serve them. And at a time when it was considered really impolite and even dangerous for women to walk on the streets by themselves in public, department stores really gave them an excuse to stroll and congregate on their own. Peeling back the glossy layers of these stores, unseen by the crowds, were the army of harried saleswomen checking the stock rooms in the hopes of satisfying impatient customers, and the girls known as wrappers, furiously folding sweaters into boxes and typing ribbons with amazing dexterity. As women increasingly entered the workforce, department stores actually became a sort of refuge where ambitious employees could receive instruction and the opportunity to rise through the ranks. There were female bookkeepers, powerful female fashion buyers who went to Paris regularly as early as 1906. And female copywriters who would contemplate, Cracker Jack ad copy for the Sunday's paper. Here you have a group of bookkeepers. my book focuses on three stores in particular, although I do cover a number of other ones. But here I'm going to focus on three, as well as three equally impressive but very, very different women who ran them. Let's see. That's actually, I'll go through it here, even though it's not in my written words. This is a dentist office that was actually normal in department stores for employees. They had all kinds of things. Let's see if I can get to Bonwit Teller. Here we go. But Bonwit Teller is one of the stores I'm really going to focus on. It was founded in 1907, and it was one of New York's, most exclusive, well-appointed department stores. During the Great Depression, however, like so many other businesses, it really was teetering on the cusp of bankruptcy. Its founder, the German emigre Paul Bonwit, was forced to sell it, and he remained on as president, but the new owner was Floyd Odlum. Floyd was this Wall Street tycoon who, unlike almost every other American in the country, actually made it rich during the Great Depression. He was very prescient, and somehow he decided to sell almost all of his stocks just weeks before the 1929 crash. So he was very wealthy while most other people weren't. And Floyd is an interesting character. He grew up as a cowboy in Colorado, and he was definitely not a shopper. But since he bought Bonwit Teller sort of as part of a larger acquisition with many other companies, and because Bonwit Teller really was a money loser, he just planned to close the store. But in those years, that really would have meant throwing hundreds of employees out of work at a time when there were really no jobs to have. And it could have possibly led to, destitution or even starvation for these people. So instead of closing the store, Floyd asked his wife, Hortense, who I'm hoping, here we go, if she might go to Bonwit Teller and see how there might be some way to save the store. Hortense grew up far away from the world of the Fifth Avenue department stores. She grew up in a tiny town near what is now Mount Zion Park in Utah. She had a hard scrabble childhood. Her parents were early converts to the Mormon Church and arrived from Europe and were some of the first white people to settle in the area. And they helped found a town called St. George. Which is a very beautiful place. I was there for research. So Hortense spent a pretty hard scrabble childhood, growing her own food, really making everything she wore. And it's an interesting story how she met Floyd and both of them ended up in New York City. And while I could definitely tell you guys all of that now, I feel like I will leave it for you to read it in the book. But needless to say, she did go to Bonwit Teller. She followed her husband's directive, and in a matter of about a year, Hortense, who had actually never held a paying job before, was named president of Bonwit Teller, taking over for the founder. And about a year after that, Bonwit Teller was actually more profitable than it had been even during the heyday of the Jazz Age when the economy was booming. So she did a pretty amazing job. She did a lot of things that turned Bonwit Teller around. I'm gonna highlight one of them. I don't think that the image is in this version of the slideshow, but I'll tell you about it. She was an excellent marketer. She helped create a book, Polly Tucker, which I have here, Polly Tucker Merchant, which is the story of Polly Tucker, a fictional girl who wants to work at a department store a lot like Bonwit Teller. It actually became a bestseller, and she created a line of clothing, Polly Tucker Clothes, for young women who wanted to enter the workforce. She sponsored this contest, which is kind of a funny contest. It was called Make the Most of Yourself, which was essentially a beauty pageant held in reverse. The winner was one of the least attractive people, with the idea that this ugly duckling would be transformed by the ministrations of the Bonwit Teller stylists. So the winner was actually this woman, Callie Foots, who wrote the judges that I have a proboscis that would make Jimmy Durant look to his laurels, and she compared herself to Bull Montana with a hangover. She actually was quite pretty when I looked at the pictures, but anyway, she came to New York and she visited a dietitian. Bonwit Teller gave her all new clothes. She got a new haircut. They even made an appointment with a plastic surgeon who gave her a nose job. And all of this was avidly followed by the press and, all the consumers and Bonwit Teller shoppers. When they revealed the before and after, they actually ran an advertising campaign with her face, showing how she was now so beautiful, and noting that she'd even changed her name from Callie Foots to Carol Faust, which I found a Faustian bargain, to be sure. But while Hortense was very successful at Bonwit Teller, things were definitely not perfect for her in her personal life. I will say that I'm not going to get into all the details, but Jackie Cochran, who was a very famous aviatrix at the time and a close friend of Amelia Earhart, you can see her there on the upper left corner with Amelia. She had something to do with it. There's a picture on the right of Floyd with Jackie. And in fact, Hortense sort of came to blame her career and Bonwit Teller for some of her personal troubles, which I get into in the book too. Okay, this is a Bonwit Teller window. Another story I focus on is Lord & Taylor and Dorothy Shaver, who you can see here. Lord & Taylor was one of America's oldest stores. It was founded in 1826 by Samuel Lord as a small dry goods outpost near the fishing docks on the East River waterfront. In 1924, Lord & Taylor hired Dorothy. By then, the store had moved uptown to where we all maybe remember it, on Fifth Avenue and 38th Street, and it had, 2,200 employees, an employee cafeteria, a dentist office, which I showed you earlier. They even had an in-house chiropodist, which helped heal the aching feet of its saleswomen. And for Dorothy, this was a big deal. She was a small town girl from Arkansas. She arrived in New York City in 1919 with her sister Elsie, and they just had a suitcase between them. But by 1924, when she's hired at Lord & Taylor, she had really established herself as a savvy businesswoman. Her and her sister Elsie started a business, a doll business, in fact. Elsie was an artist and she made the dolls, and Dorothy sold them. I might have a picture here, I think. There's Elsie. You can see Dorothy and Elsie there. I will just see. Yes, here are the dolls, the little shavers. And it was quite a feat having their own store and their own business. And eventually Elsie grew sick of it and wanted to go back to making her art. So Dorothy took the job at Lord & Taylor. Dorothy and Elsie, they never married. Dorothy famously quipped, "I'd far rather have a brilliant career than a humdrum married life." She lived with Elsie. The two sisters, and they definitely were biological sisters, had a very adventurous life filled with intellectual and physical pursuits. For instance, Dorothy was on the board of the United Negro College Fund. She was friends with, James Farley, many, many important people. She was on the board of the Met, actually. She helped create the Costume Institute and the famous fundraising ball, the Met Gala, which just happened recently. They traveled extensively, going to even Stalinist Russia at a time when obviously that was not common. Dorothy had many, many contributions to Lord & Taylor and to the American fashion industry. I will see, there's Lord & Taylor. She actually came out with the famous rose insignia, which you see there on the awning. So one of her biggest contributions was in the early 1930s. She was actually, under her guidance, Lord & Taylor became the first store to put the name of American designers on its advertising. And she even created, as you can see here, a window display advertising American designers like Claire McCardell, all these people. Really, up until then, fashion was only in Paris. The American garment industry, it was really the rag men. They just made cheap knockoffs. They were not known as having design, actual original designs. They were all Parisian copies. And when Paris was occupied by the Nazis during the war, it was really Dorothy who was a chief architect of really getting the American fashion industry going. There's a department she had at Lord & Taylor featuring American designs, which was very unusual. Here we go. In 1945, Dorothy became president of Lord & Taylor, and Life magazine ran a feature on her titled America's #1 Career Woman. She was paid the highest published salary ever for a female executive at that time, earning the equivalent of about $1.65 million in today's money. Still, it was about more than $400,000 less. It was $410,000 less than the man whom she replaced. So while it was a lot of money, it was still not quite as much as her colleagues. The final store I delve into in the book is Henri Bendel's, which was a very elegant store, perhaps one of the chicest stores in New York. It was run by so in 1959, when Geraldine Stutz, who's a character, who's the third woman in my book, here she is, when she gets hired to run Bendel's. Bendel's is not really chic anymore. By then, it was sort of this dowdy place for wealthy dowagers. It was not a place that young people shopped. Geraldine was a fashion editor at Glamour magazine, and she came from Chicago, and she had caught the attention of the owner of Henri Bendel's, and he hired her when she was only 33 years old. She really changed the store forever and actually had a huge impact on the department store industry in general, mostly because she did many things, but one of her biggest things was she created the Street of Shops, which we can see here. Bendel's was a very small building for a department store. And when Geraldine took over, the main floor was very dark. It was very long and narrow, and it was not ideal for shopping. So Geraldine she had a fashion editor's eye and sort of an ingenious merchandising instinct. And so she, along with her architect, came up with kind of an ingenious idea to create mini shops along a street, which was called the Street of Shops. You can see here, there's Sentiments, for instance. They all had these little stores that sold their own goods. So Sentiments sold perfumes. The Leg Shop specialized in colorful stockings. Everything was very carefully curated, and very quickly it became, the chicest place to shop in New York in the 1960s and the 1970s. Actually, this is an image when she was an editor back at Glamour, Andy Warhol was just starting out, and she was one of his first hires. She was an editor. She was the shoe editor. She did all the shoe accessories for Glamour, and she hired him to do the shoe illustrations. So here is an example of one of his shoe illustrations. And he would go on and helped her do some other advertising before he became way too big to focus on that kind of thing. Here you can see her with a bunch of designers and her very famous doorman, Buster the doorman, who's holding the whistle there. He was sort of an icon of Bendel's, and these are a number of famous designers that she helped found in the 1960s and 1970s. But in 1985, the mall craze really took over America. You know, everyone wanted Benetton and the Gap, and not exactly Geraldine style. You know, she used to joke that Bendel's style was dog whistle style. Clothes with a pitch so high and special that only the thinnest and most sophisticated women would hear their call. So you can see that wasn't exactly fitting in with the 1980s ethos of the mall era. So she was really struggling to make Bendel's work. And actually, through various things that happened, she was a part owner of the business. And by then, she was the first woman to ever own a major Fifth Avenue department store. But she had partners, and they were really pressuring her to sell. So her partners sort of looked around. They were deciding what to do. They really didn't want to keep the store. And eventually Les Wexner, who I have here, the bachelor billionaire, as New York Magazine put him, bought Bendel's. And as you can see from the other cover here, there was really a battle that ensued. It was such a clash of cultures between Les Wexner, who you may know owned The Limited and Victoria's Secret, and came from Ohio, and Geraldine's sensibilities. So she stayed on for a little bit of time, but eventually she quit in disgust and went on to have a career in publishing, actually. But so Les Wexner owned it for a long time, and sort of Bendel's, like many department stores, had a slow decline. And in 2019, you know, the department store industry was changed irrevocably, and we can talk about that. But the advent of the internet and all kinds of things changed the way shopping was done, and Wexner actually closed Bendel's. So that was the end of the store. I will tell you about the endings for the other stores too. As for Bonwit Teller, in 1979, it was actually purchased by Donald Trump. He wanted to demolish it to make way for Trump Tower, and that is where Trump Tower is now. It's where the old Bonwit Teller was. The Bonwit Teller building had a number of very important architectural details. As you can see some of them here, they were bas reliefs. They had these important iron gratings, and actually Donald Trump said he would donate these things to the Met, which very much wanted them before he demolished it. But one day, everyone was surprised when construction workers climbed the facade of the Bonwit Teller building and jackhammered all these details off before they could be donated. So there was a lot of controversy in New York City, many op-eds written about it. Donald Trump at first claimed that they didn't have architectural merit, and then said that he had no choice, that they had posed a danger and could fall on pedestrians below. So that was what happened to Bonwit Teller. And as for Lord & Taylor, after Dorothy died, the store continued on for a number of decades, but like Bendel's, it slowly declined. And actually, a few weeks before Bendel's closed, Lord & Taylor also closed. It was purchased by WeWork to become its headquarters. But when WeWork imploded, it was actually purchased then by Amazon to become its New York headquarters. So it is currently, the Lord & Taylor building is currently the headquarters for Amazon. And I'm closing with this image here, which is an old ad that Dorothy had done. It's actually done by the artist Dorothy Hood, who Dorothy Shaver hired. And it was one of her sort of inventions. Before that, advertising was covered with text and lots of information, and Dorothy really hired this artist to create this image and created a lot of white space and did a whole different thing. But anyway, now Lord & Taylor is filled with Amazon workers, and you know, Bonwit Teller is no more, and neither is Bendel's. So I will close it off there. And I would love to take questions or anything more. I guess I can stop my screen sharing.
Well, you definitely whetted our appetites, Julie. I mean, it's really fascinating information. And I know I want to hear more about the individual lives and kind of business acumen of these women, but you've given us a big picture. When we were chatting a little before, you predicted that I would be asking you about your sources. So do tell us how you came on the topic, how you did the research. You spent a number of years pursuing these women. So tell us a little bit about the background of that.
Yeah, so you know, after I wrote The Plaza, I was sort of trying to figure out another book idea, and my agent wanted me to do Store Wars, is what she called it, which is a sort of a, you know, battle of stores. And I really didn't want to do a building anymore. I wanted to do a people. So I began kind of investigating the world of department stores, and I stumbled on these women, and I, you know, fell in love with them, but there's very little known about them. None of them have ever had biographies written about them. You know, they never, Hortense wrote an autobiography in 1939, so I had that to go on. But other than that, you know, it was the materials were somewhat limited. So I struggled. For Hortense, I went to, you know, her hometown. There is a settler museum about the history of the town, and they had a lot about her family. You know, Mormons care a lot about their genealogy, so they had a lot of information about how she came there and her background, so that was useful. And during her lifetime, there were stories written about her, since she was a big deal. She had a New York Times op-ed, obituary rather, when she died. So there were some newspapers that I could use. And it was, yeah, so and I tracked down all of her relatives. She's the only woman who had kids, so I was able to talk with her grandchildren, and got images and stories from them. For Dorothy, she was probably the most famous of all the women during her lifetime. So there's quite a lot of information about her. There's actually an archive of her papers in the Smithsonian. And also at Harvard, Radcliffe has her papers. So I went and looked at the archives there and the clippings. I hired a genealogist because she did not have children, and I hired a genealogist who discovered her great grandniece. And, you know, it was one of those aha moments for researchers, because she happened to have a basement filled with all this stuff, art that Elsie had drawn and papers and all kinds of things. So that was wonderful. I managed to discover a lot of new things about Dorothy through that. And I also went to Mena, Arkansas, where she's from, which was a fascinating trip, and learned all about her upbringing, which was very, very interesting, and I get into in the book. And then Geraldine, she's the most recent of the characters. So I was able to do some traditional reporting for that. I interviewed a bunch of many, you know, dozens of women who worked for her at Bendel's. She died in 2005, so I wasn't able to interview her, but her sister also had a number of children. So I interviewed all the children, and I talked with people who'd worked, you know, for her, and I was able to get a really big picture that way. And actually, Parsons did a really amazing job researching her for their program. There's a professor there who did a whole Hazel Clark. She did a whole program on Geraldine and everything she did, really creating the ready-to-wear industry in America and all of this. And so Hazel had a lot of wonderful resources she shared with me. So
Hmm.
it's a long answer. Sorry.
No, that's great, and it's fascinating. I'm inviting people to put your own questions into the chat, and I'll moderate those, or I'll relay them. But I have tons of other questions that I want to ask. And just in what you were saying, mentioning the Radcliffe archive, I guess, did any of the three women go to college? And
Yes.
yeah, and then how did they? How did they acquire their business chops?
Yes. So actually, only one of the women finished college. Dorothy did go to the University of Arkansas, but she dropped out after about a year and took some classes at the University of Chicago, but again, dropped out. Geraldine did finish college. She went to Mundelein College, which is no longer around. Geraldine grew up very Catholic, and she went to Catholic school all her life, and it was a Catholic college. So I did get some great stuff there. I went to Chicago and I went to their archive. It's now part of Loyola University, and so I did that, which was exciting. But yeah, it wasn't easy. So.
And then what you mentioned, Parsons, and this makes me think of the fashion industry. And glamour is part of your subtitle. I mean, maybe you could expand on the world of fashion, the world of couture and design. And then, of course, there were other departments too. Were they ambidextrous? Were they, how adept were they? And how did they work with their buyers? Did they set the taste, or did they reflect?
Yeah, it was such an interesting ecosystem to learn about this, actually. So I do get into fashion more, definitely. It was sort of this very great moment in America, or very interesting moment, because it really was kind of this transition from the garment district being, as I said, sort of more mass manufacturing to really fashion design here, domestic fashion design. So yeah, they all had a lot of importance in terms of in terms of fashion. Hortense, she was really early on. It was the 1930s, so it was still not quite there. I mean, she did make forays, as I mentioned, into like the kind of clothing that young career women would wear, which was something that department stores did not have before, a little more sporty, a little more, businessy for women. But really Dorothy was the first one to kind of really make that impact. And she discovered, Elizabeth Hawes, for instance, which I go into in the book. She is this very quirky designer who started out in Paris and then came to New York, and Dorothy really helped foster her career and kind of this idea of American sportswear, which was sort of how America kind of differentiated itself from Paris. Paris was haute couture, these very expensive clothing, and then we'd have these cheap kind of copies in America of these haute couture gowns, but that was really all we had. And in America, they wanted clothing to go to a football game or to play with their kids, and it was a much more sporty kind of athletic feel, and that really wasn't something that Paris had. So that's how American designers really got in to the market, and they began making kind of sportswear. The first bikinis, bathing suits, all that stuff was sort of American American made. So, and then Geraldine had an incredible role with fashion in the 60s and 70s. She discovered so many designers, Sonia Rykiel, Stephen Burrows. I mean, because Bendel's was smaller, her business model was essentially to go out and find undiscovered talent and be able to get them to come and have their clothing at her store, because she couldn't really compete with Bloomingdale's and Macy's buying all this clothes. So instead, she went to these smaller makers and really promoted them. And a lot of them went on to have huge, huge careers. So,
Uh,
yeah.
Someone in the chat is asking us, did the women meet each other? Were
I know, that would be amazing. If this was a fiction book, yes, they would have met each other. They did not. Dorothy and Hortense, I have some indication that that knew of each other for sure. I think they all, they sort of, I saw it as they kind of had conversations with each other over the eras, because they really built upon one another. Each one kind of did its thing, and the other one kind of took that and ran with it in its own way. So they conversed through time with each other, and I felt like I was conversing with them as well, just as a working woman and as in that way. So but they didn't actually meet or work together. They were kind of chronologically in different eras. So 1930s and 40s, 1950s, really, and then 60s through the 80s. So, yeah.
and I'm not sure you made clear what their husbands were actually doing.
Yeah, well, only one of them really had a husband, Hortense. So, and he eventually they divorced, so he was kind of out of the picture. So he bought Bonwit Teller, he brought her on, and then he ended up the marriage didn't end up working out, and so she really they did have a business relationship, but that was about it. Geraldine was married for a little while, but not for long, and didn't have any children. So it was really interesting to me, kind of the sacrifices that had to be made to have a career at that time. Hortense was the only one who was a mother. She had two sons. And how really a lot of the challenges that these women faced feel very familiar to today. They're not actually that different, which was sort of interesting in its own way. So.
And here's another question from Paul Crowther, who says that as a one-time employee of Houston's Lord and Taylor store, how did its expansion to other cities change its reputation and its New York business?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, Dorothy at Lord and Taylor was kind of the person who came up with branch stores. She created her first Lord and Taylor in Long Island in the 1940s, and what happened was, in kind of the post-war years with suburbia, all of that happening, stores decided that that was the way that they could grow, that they would open these branch stores. And they did. They opened prolific numbers of branch stores and all over the country. Nordstrom, Lord and Taylor, all of them did that. What ended up happening, though, is that as the branch stores proliferated, the kind of downtown stores lost their importance, because why leave your suburban enclave and drive into the city where you couldn't park and everything to go shopping when it was right there for you? So it sort of led to the kind of a downturn in the main stores. And then what happened was, in the 1960s, basically the advent of the discount stores, so Target, Walmart, really created competition for the department stores that was very, very hard for them to deal with. And there kind of became this spiraling down of quality and salaries, as they kept trying to cut costs to compete with the discount stores. So sort of the branch stores, um, like what is the word I'm thinking of, diffuse their branding, kind of made it harder for them to have these brands and made the main stores really suffer. And then that combined with the discount stores really created a tough environment for department stores, and they never really recovered from that. I'm online, the internet basically was the final death knell for many of them, but it really began actually with kind of the branch stores and the discount stores.
Well, we do have one question about competition, but I think it's placing it back within the competition of Manhattan. What about other stores? I mean, we think of Bloomingdale's, which was always the kind of go-to New Yorkers store.
Yeah,
Which is
growing up.
national
Yeah, growing up,
famous.
Bloomingdale's was where I bought all my school clothes.
Yeah.
They're now owned by Macy's. What ended up happening, sort of when Geraldine sold Bendel's in the 80s and stuff, there started becoming all this, conglomerates and all these, there always were, but there was all these merging of stores, and Macy's bought JCPenney's, bought blah, blah. And like, it's so confusing. It's like a maze of store acquisitions. And so Bloomingdale's is now owned by Macy's, actually. And, there just became fewer and fewer owners. And, it had always been for many, many decades, department stores were largely family-owned businesses in many cases. And so that also helped kind of hurt the brand, because when you own a bunch of stores, you start consolidating how you do your payment methods or the buying, and the uniqueness of these stores kind of started to go away, and they all ended up kind of being somewhat similar. Even Bloomingdale's, I don't know where you shop now, but if you go there, but it's hard for them to differentiate between each other. Maybe
Mhm.
except for Bergdorf Goodman in New York. I don't know. I feel like it stands alone, and Saks, I guess, but
Well, I mean, what you do in focusing on this period is really to take not a moment, but a phase, an era in American history where going downtown, even though it was uptown in New York, really had a kind of status that you associated with a lifestyle, a class
yeah,
identification, which it was
yeah,
certainly clear in all three of these stores. But there's some other questions, but I want to be sure to get mine in, and that is Fifth Avenue really does play an important role, as per your title, but also in respect to your history as a real estate reporter. Can you talk about Fifth Avenue, because the Plaza and
yeah,
Bonwit's and Bendel's are
yeah.
one kind of location. Lord and Taylor's is equal, and Saks are equally important and high status stores, but are farther away, but they're on Fifth Avenue. So,
True.
talk about that.
Yeah. Yes. So really the department store industry kind of followed the development of Manhattan in many ways, and Fifth Avenue for sure. It started out with sort of Ladies Mile, which, as I mentioned, was there really began, Wanamaker's was at Astor Place, actually, where the new Wegmans is, if anyone has gone. That used to be Wanamaker's. And that was a big deal. And as the industry expanded, it began moving uptown, as people began moving uptown as well. And actually Bendel's was the first store to really go all the way uptown to 57th Street. They were really a pioneer. They went up there in 1914 when it was really a residential area and not a commercial. But the development of the industry does follow kind of that development of New York uptown and Fifth Avenue. And I'm actually writing another book for Asoline about the history of Fifth Avenue, where I go through the whole history of the avenue. So it's it's also the history of New York is Fifth Avenue. A lot of the stores congregated there because it's where it was most prestigious. You know, it was the most prestigious street. Actually, 57th Street used to be very prestigious, but then Bendel's, which is where it originally was, moved to Fifth Avenue to where it was when it closed at 714 Fifth, because being on a side street wasn't as nice anymore, and you know, you really had to be on the avenue. That wasn't true at first, you know, but yeah. So, and Lord and Taylor, you know, that was back then, that was considered, you know, right next to the New York Public Library and stuff. Of course, they were going to actually move further uptown at one point. Dorothy wanted to, because it was a bit more prestigious in the 50s, but with the advent of the branch stores and kind of the difficulties that they were having, they never ended up executing that move. So they stayed there.
We have another question I'll be sure to insert here. And anybody else who wants to get in the last question or two, we might be able to take them. Elizabeth Simpson would like to know, did these women support and mentor any others coming up in the field, or did they just promote men to leadership?
Interesting question. Yes, I think that it depends on who. Dorothy definitely did. She had some women that she focused on. I think less so. I think Hortense and Dorothy less so. I think that wasn't really, like, they struggled so hard just to get a foothold in that I don't think they felt that sort of modern sensibility that we have to kind of give back and help bring up a new generation of women. Geraldine, it was a different story. You know, this was the 1960s and the 1970s, the advent of the women's movement. You know, she was very focused on that. Almost the entire store was almost all women. She basically had only one male employee, Charlie, who was sort of the business guy. And you know, and I think there were a few others, especially the window designers were men. They were like Joel Schumacher, the director of Batman, was actually a window designer for her. But she was really a mentor to so many women. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the saleswomen I spoke to just gushed about what a special moment it was. Someone called it like Camelot. It was sort of this unique moment where she was basically, her idea for managing was, if I hire you, then I trust you, then you go for it. And she let these young people, I mean, they were in their 20s, early 20s, run entire departments, go off and find designers. I mean, they had so much freedom to do so many interesting things, which is partly why the store was so exciting under her. She was not a top-down manager at all. So she really did care about that. And actually, Joel Schumacher said that she saved his life because he was deep into his drug addiction when she brought him on to do the windows. And he was a man, but she did that for many people. So yeah.
So my question is, do you think the three women were more like each other or separate? But because they represented different decades.
They're very different. Yeah. And I mean, it's hard to give you the whole feel in the slideshow, but Hortense was actually kind of a sad, tragic figure. I don't think they're not at all alike at all. I found it very interesting. I think at one point, I don't have the exact words, but I sort of said that, you know, Hortense really didn't want to be a businesswoman. She really eschewed that title. She always compared herself to just a hostess, a woman who was like sort of a hostess hosting dinner. She did not like the term businesswoman. Dorothy really kind of aped a businessman. You know, she gave up any kind of romantic life, and she really took on the mantle of kind of manliness in many ways. And Geraldine was the most modern. I think she really tried to synthesize all of that. She embraced being a businesswoman, but she also embraced her femininity. But of course, she definitely had her own hang-ups that are very notable. Like, she was a real sexist, a sizist, rather, I should say. She really only wanted to have small sizes at Bendel. She wanted everyone to be thin. So she had her own kind of social pressures that she gave into, you know, and the male gaze. And stuff. So they were interesting, and I really do urge you to read it, because I think you'll have a much better understanding of the characters that way. And I would love anyone to email me if they have any thoughts and stuff after they do read it, or even now, because I'd love to get feedback from readers and see what they think. But it was confusing and interesting and fascinating, and I'm definitely committed to only writing about people, not buildings now, I feel like. So.
Well, we won't hold that to get to the Skyscraper Museum. But,
True, true. Okay. Well,
well,
always told through the lens of the buildings.
um, I have a last question, even though those sounded rather like concluding remarks, but I'll
Okay.
conclude after this one. New Yorkers versus tourists. You know, what do you know about the consumers and their responses?
Yes, interesting. So let's see. Stores are really a local business in many ways. I mean, I obviously tourists come for sure. The main thing with tourists and department stores are the windows, which I didn't get into here, but there is an entire art form of department store windows, and these window dressers did amazing things. One of the stories I didn't do, but had a slide of, was actually Salvador Dali. They had artists come and do their windows. Salvador Dali did windows. Georgia O'Keeffe did windows. All these famous people, and even today, right? We all know about the holiday windows in New York. So that's really where is sort of the spectacle aspect of department stores. Other than that, I think that the regular shoppers, the people who really went to the stores regularly, were locals, and the buyers really geared their dresses and clothing to their local populations. Which is why when branch stores started to consolidate and people in Chicago were buying clothes for people in Florida, it didn't totally translate as well. But yeah, window dressing, I would say, is the way that tourists really engaged with the stores more than anything.
Hmm. It's interesting, though, that to walk Fifth Avenue today, or as I do, cycle on Fifth Avenue. So as you pass many stores in the 20 blocks or so south of 59th Street, they're mostly brands that are dedicated to just whether it's high-end fashion, whether it's Prada or Cartier or Nike. They're operations which are themselves vertically integrated in the stores.
Yeah, I think that nowadays, because of the financial landscape, stores have really kind of picked a lane. And it used to be that you could go to a store and, buy cheap packs of underwear and also look at a fur coat. It had everything in it. Nowadays, it's really bifurcated. You've got the very high-end stores like a Bergdorf Goodman, and then you have like a Marshalls, and because that's the only way to really reach consumers at this point, they've really doubled down on that, which I think is kind of takes away the heart of what a department store was meant to be, and the sort of spectacular wonder of it. It's very, and then of course the single brands have their own stores, especially along Fifth Avenue, so that also makes it even harder, because why go to Saks to buy Nike sneakers when you can just go to Nike and get them? So all of that is the reason why we don't have these stores anymore, sadly.
Well, it's just 7 o'clock, so we have expanded into the many departments of New York department stores, fashion, glamour, as you say. This really is a fascinating history, and it is a history. I myself remember these stores in their heyday, where I would mostly look and wait for the January sales or something. But it was always an experience, and it's wonderful to know that it was women who were shaping these environments so importantly in the American mid-century. So and in New York, because this really is a story about big cities and the way people come together in urban space and create great luxurious avenues of visual culture and consumption. So thanks for putting that whole extravaganza in front of us. And we urge everybody to go and find the book online. It's a double-day publication, but there you can buy it at any bookstores. And I think in the reminder that we sent around earlier today, you can just click on the link and find the book and boost Julie's sales pre-publication. That's always super important. So we're really happy that we were your maiden voyage on the book tour.
Yes, thank you for being my guinea pigs, guys. I
It was
really
really
appreciate
terrific.
it.
Thanks so much, Julie. And thanks everybody else for joining us. See you next time, everybody.
Bye.